Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video today we're going to be discussing some more season previews. We are on to week 2 of the season previews, talking about two Pacific Division teams in the LA Kings and the Stanley Cup champion Vegas Golden Knights. How are they doing the offseason and how are things shaping up for these two teams heading into the 23-24 season? We'll go to all of that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the Internet Hockey Channel. Now, as usual, this is the second week of our season preview series. We'll look at a couple of things for the LA Kings and the Vegas Golden Knights. We'll start with how they finished up last year, the season that they had, the playoffs that they had. We'll go over to the additions, subtractions they had in the offseason, how they really balanced out. We'll look at the top 3 picks that each of these teams made in the 2023 draft. We'll look at what my current projections are for the team's lineups for entering the 23-24 season. We'll see exactly what my projected point totals are for those two teams, where I see them finishing in the standings, and then I'll give them my grade of how I think they did in the offseason and how I think they've improved their teams going into next season. So we're going to start here with the LA Kings. The Kings had a really productive 22-23 season. Just like the 21-22 season, they were a really dominant team, and they finished 3rd in the Pacific. They were able to get a 47-25-10 record for 104 points, good enough for 3rd in the Pacific and 5th in the Western Conference. So a really good season there for the LA Kings. They really pushed hard. They were definitely a lot better than they were the previous year when they had under 100 points, but they were in the exact same position of 3rd in the Pacific. They went into the first round series against the Edmonton Oilers, were able to take a 1-0 and 2-1 series lead in that first round series, but would lose games 4, 5, and 6 to drop that series in 6 games to the Oilers 4-2. So same result as they happened in round 1 of the 21-22 season. Once again, 3rd in the Pacific, went to Edmonton in the first round, and got booted in the first round by the Oilers. So Oilers seem to be the Kings' kryptonite up to this point, and hopefully for the Kings next year, it does not happen again, finishing 3rd in the Pacific and losing to the Edmonton Oilers. It just seems like it's a repetitive cycle at this point. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with LA this year. But definitely, they had a good season last year. They were a dominant team in the Pacific, but they just could not get past the Edmonton Oilers. So let's go over and look at the off-season losses and the additions that the team lost. So here's the list of the additions and subtractions that the team made this offseason. So if you look at the losses, they lost Gabriel Velarde, Alex Iafallo, and Rasmus Kupari all to Winnipeg in the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. So Velarde was a decent middle 6 forward, mostly playing 3rd line minutes. Iafallo was a decent middle 6 forward, mostly playing 3rd line minutes. Kupari was a good young player who had yet to really establish himself as an NHL player, playing mostly bottom 6 minutes. So for the Kings, some pretty good players there going to Winnipeg. They also lost Zach McEwen in free agency to Ottawa. They lost young prospect Aiden Dubois in free agency. He's still UFA. I'm quite surprised that they did not resign him. They lost Elias Anderson, former first round pick, 7th overall from the New York Rangers a couple of years back in 2017 to the Montreal Canadiens. So they lost a couple of decent players in the forward group. Defensively, they lost Alex Edler, who's UFA right now. They lost Sean Walker to Philadelphia, as well as prospect Helgi Grans to Philadelphia in the Ivan Provorov deal. They also lost Sean Durzi to Arizona in a trade there that sent Durzi to Arizona. So they lost a couple of key defensemen as well. And then on the goaltending side, they would lose Cal Peterson in the Provorov trade to Philadelphia, and they also lost Jonas Korpisalo, who was their starting goaltender in the playoffs last year, to the Ottawa Senators. So some pretty bad losses there for the Kings. Definitely some loss in depth in that team. But they did get some players back. They added, like we said, Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. They acquired Pierre-Luc Dubois and signed him to an 8-year contract extension. That was a major addition there for the Kings. They were able to get Trevor Lewis back, former King from a while ago, has been bounced around the past couple of years. Played with Calgary last year. Had some decent point totals. Should be a good bomb 6 forward. That's a solid addition there for the Kings in the forward group. They also acquired Mikhail Maltsev, who's a good bomb 6 depth addition there on the forward group. They added Andreas Englund, who's a decent 6-7 defenseman. They also had Kevin Connaughton, who's a decent 7th, 8th defenseman in the Philadelphia trade that helped the Jackets acquire Ivan Provorov. And and they also acquired 2 goaltenders in free agency, Talbot from Ottawa and Riddick from Winnipeg. So they were able to get a couple of decent goaltenders. So in my opinion, not a bad offseason, but not a fantastic one. The offense, they definitely lost a lot of depth. I mean, don't get me wrong, and Dubois is fantastic. And that center depth, you have Deneau, you have Kopitar, you have Dubois. That's an elite level center depth. I think that's the best 1-2-3 punch in the NHL right now. It would not surprise me at all if the Kings were the best team down the middle in the NHL right now. So I don't think that's too much of a surprise, but they do lose some depth, losing McEwen, losing Elias Anderson, losing Rasmus Kupari, as well as Iafallo and Velarde, only getting Trevor Lewis and Mikhail Maltsev to replace those guys on top of Dubois. So they do lose a bit of depth here, but they have a ton of young players. They have Arthur Kaliev, they have Carl Grundstrom, Samuel Fagemo, Akil Thomas, Tyler Madden, Alex Turcotte. There's a ton of players there in LA who could definitely step up and take bomb six roles. So as much as they did not replace any of those guys in free agency or via trade, they have a lot of young players waiting in the wings. So I am not really worried at all that the Kings didn't really replace a ton of their depth that they lost. And I think getting and extending Dubois really does make that center depth lethal. Defensively, same sort of thing. They lost a couple of key pieces. Jersey was a good offensive defenseman playing on second, third pair minutes last year. Walker was a decent second or third pair defenseman. Edler was a good 6th, 7th defenseman. Granz is a good defensive prospect. So losing all those guys is pretty bad, especially when they only got Kevin Cannon, who's a good depth defenseman. And they also got Andreas Englund, who could definitely probably fill in for Alex Edler's role in the 6th, 7th spot. But they did have a couple of additions. I mean, they have enough defensemen. They could have guys like Jordan Spence, Tobias Bjornfoot, Jacob Mouvrier, all fighting for like a spot on this team. I think Brandon Clark should definitely make the NHL this year. A solid offensive defenseman, one of the top defensive prospects in the NHL. Not probably one of the elite level prospects, but a really good defensive prospect in the NHL. So I think he should definitely make the roster this year. You could have Vladislav Gavrikov for a full year now that they've extended him. So the Kings' defense doesn't look too bad, but their goaltending does look a little bit weaker in my opinion. Last year they had Korpisalo, they had Quick, they had Copley, they had Cal Peterson. So they have 4 goaltenders. They were able to make do throughout the season until playoffs. Korpisalo did all right in the first 3 games, but didn't do overly well in the last 3. They bring in Talbot this year. They bring in Riddick. Riddick, I think, can be a good third stringer. They send him down to the minors. If there's injuries, he can definitely be a decent backup. They have Copley being the 1B. Talbot can be the 1A. I do still wonder about Talbot's injury history. He does have a lot of injuries, especially when last year he was really banged up for the Senators. So I do have some concerns there, but I do still think that team is going to be a really lethal team. I think they did all right on the forward group. They did pretty well on the defensive end. I do still have my questions about goaltending, but they did what they could with their tight cap situation, and I think if Talbot can stay healthy and Copley can play just like he did last year, a Talbot-Copley tandem could definitely get them into the playoffs and definitely help them in the playoffs as well. So I'm not really worried that is going to be a huge problem for the Kings. The top 3 draft selections for the LA Kings during the 2023 NHL entry draft, their first pick was the 22nd pick in the second round. They selected left defenseman Jacob Dvorak. Their second pick of the 2023 draft was in the third round, 14th overall, selecting right winger Cohen Zimmer. And their third pick in this draft was in the fourth round, number 22nd overall, taking goalie Slakinski. So they definitely had a couple of decent picks in this draft. Once again, not a ton of elite level, high-end draft selections for the Kings this year, but they did make good on all of their picks they did have. So some pretty good drafting there from the Kings. As you can see here, my current 2023 projected lineup for the LA Kings. I have Quinn Byfield playing on top line with Andrei Kopitar and Adrian Kempe. I have Trevor Moore playing on the second line with Philip Deneau and Vic Arvidsson. I have Arthur Kaliev playing on the third line with Pierre Dubois and Kevin Fiala. And in my opinion, second and third lines can flip-flop either way. I could see Dubois centering the second line or Deneau centering the second line. Those are 2 really good lines in my opinion, and they could be flip-flopped either way. I also have Carl Grundstrom playing with Blake Lizotte and Trevor Lewis on the fourth line. I have on the defensive end Mikey Anderson playing with Drew Doughty. I have Brendan Clark playing with Vladislav Gavrikov, and I have Tobias Bjornfoot playing with Matt Roy on the third pair. I have Talbot being the 1A, I have Copley being the 1B, and I have Andreas Englund being the lone spare, with the Kings being able to ice a 20-man roster while being cap compliant. So in my opinion, it's a decent roster. It's not as deep. If there are injuries to that team, especially on the defensive end or in goaltending, I think they're going to have some trouble. But if they can stay healthy, this team is going to be extremely lethal and extremely a team that's going to be scary to face in the Pacific Division. So in my eyes, for next year, my current projection for this team, I have them doing pretty good. I have them doing a slight bit worse, but nowhere near a step in the wrong direction. I have them finishing with a record of 46, 29, and 7 for 99 points, so just one shy of 100. I have them finishing 4th in the Pacific, as well as the first wild card in the West, finishing 5 points worse than they did last year. So I don't think it's overly surprising that I have them finishing a little bit worse than they did last year, but I still think this team is going to be lethal. I could easily see them finishing anywhere from 4th to maybe as high as 2nd in this division this year. So I think even though I have them ranked 4th, they could easily finish higher. In my opinion, I'm giving the Kings a B- rating for the offseason. They did good. The Dubois addition was a fantastic addition for the Kings. Getting Clark into the lineup, getting some more youth into the lineup is going to be good. They still added some decent pieces like Lewis, like England. I still have questions about the goaltending. I think if they were to maybe move a guy like Vic Arvidsson earlier this offseason, use his cap space to sign a better goaltender than Talbot, a better starter, I think that would have been a little bit better. So that's why I don't have them being overly good in this offseason. But I think they did quite well. I think the addition of Dubois is good. That forward group looks lethal. The defense looks pretty good. If the goaltending can hold up, I still think this team is going to be extremely lethal. But that's going to be the big question this season. So I have them finishing 99 points, 4th in the Pacific, first wild card in the West. And I think this team is going to be doing some pretty big damage in the Pacific Division this year. So I think the Kings did really good, and I'm giving them a B- rating. Now going over to the Stanley Cup champion, Vegas Golden Knights. The Golden Knights finished with a pretty good record of 51, 22, and 9 for 1st in the Pacific and the Western Conference in the regular season. They would lose Game 1 against the Winnipeg Jets, would win the next 4 to take the series in 5. They would get into a 1-0 and 2-1 hold against the Edmonton Oilers before winning 3 straight in games 4, 5, and 6 in the second round to beat the Oilers in 6 games. They would win the first 3 games against the Dallas Stars, and after losing games 4 and 5, would win game 6 and win the series in the 3rd round in 6 games over the Stars. And then they would win the first 2 games against the Panthers in the Stanley Cup final, would lose game 3, and then win games 4 and 5 to end the series in 5 games, and win the Stanley Cup for the first time in Vegas' 6-year history. So, in my opinion, Vegas definitely did really well. I think as much as a lot of people thought that they would be a bubble team, wildcard team, somewhere around the middle of the pack, I don't think anyone anticipated them at the beginning of the season last year to be the Stanley Cup champions. And I think they're going to be a scary team to face again this year. They're still a really dominant team. They're still a team who's gone to 4 conference finals in their first 6 seasons, 2 Stanley Cup finals in their first 6 seasons, and has even won a Stanley Cup final now. So they did really good this offseason. As you can see here by my additions and losses for the Knights this offseason, there's not a big list for either side. They were to lose Phil Kessel. He's a UFA right now. Decent bottom 6 forward. They lost Riley Smith. Original Golden Knight member. I'm quite surprised they did move him. But a good middle 6 forward who could definitely produce points. I think he's going to be the guy who they miss most. They also lose Teddy Bluger, who was a good 4th line depth forward for them in the playoffs, to Vancouver in free agency. They lost Nolan Patrick, who's suffered a ton of injuries over the past couple of years. He's a free agent right now. They also lose some of their goaltending depths by losing Laurent Brossoit back to Winnipeg and Jonathan Quick back to the Rangers. Their additions are also not fantastic. They added Gage Quinney, who was a decent AHL player last year for the team. They signed him to an NHL contract. They also signed Mason Gertson, who can be a decent depth forward or defenseman. He can play both forward and defense. So they added not too many players, but I don't think that was the big move here for the Golden Knights this year. The big move for Vegas was to try and keep as much of the band back together as they could, and they did. They were able to keep Aiden Hill. They were able to keep Ivan Barbashev, who are their 2 big players who are UFAs. So they were able to keep those guys. It does come at the expense of Riley Smith, but if you look at that team as a whole, they have Hill and Thompson, who are a really good 1A, 1B goalie tandem this year. I would say Thompson probably 1A, Hill's probably 1B. They can both split time, and they could be a really good tandem. They still have probably one of the best D-cores in the NHL, and they didn't subtract anything this offseason, which I think is quite surprising. Forward group, even though they lose Riley Smith and some of their depths in Blueger and Kessel, that depth is still fantastic for the Vegas Golden Knights. They still have a really good top 12 in that system, and they have a lot of depth on that organization as well. So even though they lose Riley Smith and a couple of depth pieces up front and some of their depth on the goaltending side, they still look like a really lethal team. So I'd be quite surprised if the Knights fell off majorly this year. I can see them falling off maybe a tiny bit, but not a whole bunch, as I think they did really good this offseason, keeping the band together. The top 3 picks for the Golden Knights in this year's 2023 draft, they took center David Edstrom with the 32nd overall pick in the first round. They took Matthew Cataford in the 3rd round with the number 13th overall pick, center right winger. And then they also, in the 3rd round with the 32nd overall pick, took Arttu Karki, who's a left shot defenseman. So some pretty good picks there for the Golden Knights in 2023 draft. Not an overabundance of picks, but they did have some pretty good ones. And I think with the picks they did have, they used it quite well. So some pretty good picks there from the Golden Knights. My current 23-24 projected lineup, as you can see here, has the Golden Knights top line being Barbashev, Eichel, and Marchessault. The second line being Howden paired with Stevenson and Stone. The third line being Carlson with Brendan Brisson, who I have making the NHL team this year, and Nick Roy. And I have Will Carrier playing on the 4th line with Paul Cotter and Keegan Colasar. On the defensive end, I had the exact same units that they had going into the playoffs. Martinez, Pietrangelo, McNabb, Theodore, Hagen, Whitecloud. Pretty decent defense. Then you have Thompson as your 1A, Hill as your 1B, and they have spares Pavel Dorofiev, Michael Amadio, and Braden Packel, which will give them a cap-compliant roster with Robin Lehner on long-term injury reserve. So as long as Lehner stays on long-term injury reserve, I think there's a really good chance that this is the lineup that they go through to the season with. If Lehner's injured, they may have to make another move. But I think if Lehner's on long-term injury reserve to start the season, this is the lineup that the Knights go with. In my opinion, I give them a C+ rating for the offseason. I give them a little bit above average, but they really didn't need to do much. They didn't need to do anything flashy. They didn't need to do anything really well. They lose Riley Smith, which I think is a really big blow to that team. They also lose Kessel and Blueger and Brossois, who was a really big piece of the first half of the playoffs for the Golden Knights. But in my opinion, even though they're just above average this offseason, they didn't need to do anything. They kept Hill, they kept Barbashev, they kept most of that team intact. They didn't need to do anything very flashy, and I think that's really warranting of a C+ rating. But I definitely think that in their own way, the Golden Knights really did win this offseason. So, in my opinion, I have the Knights finishing a 23-24 season with a 50-24-8 record for 108 points, which is 3 less points than they had this year, and they're finishing second in the Pacific Division. So, I don't have them really falling off too much. I have them finishing right around what they did last year. They do bump down in the standings by 1 position, but they only finished 3 points lower, and I think this is a pretty good team still. So, in my eyes, a decent offseason, a C+ rating, and a team who I think will finish second in the Pacific and will have a decent season. So, in my eyes, Kings and Knights have pretty good off-seasons. I have the Kings having a B- rating in the off-season, Knights having a C+. I have the Knights finishing second in the Pacific. I have the Kings finishing fourth in the Pacific. So, in my opinion, I think those two teams did really well this off-season. And I think both those teams are going to definitely do really well next year. So, going to be interesting to see, but that's my thoughts on the Kings and Knights going into the upcoming 23-24 season. So definitely, that's all I'm going to talk about in this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Did the Kings win their offseason? Do they warrant a B- rating? Is the Dubois addition good? Can they overcome the maybe lower level goaltending to be a really good team in the Pacific this year? Does the Knights warrant a C+ rating? Did they do overly well this year by keeping Barbashev, keeping Hill, and only getting rid of Riley Smith? Definitely love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Will the Knights finish second in the Pacific? Will the Kings finish fourth in the Pacific? Love to hear your thoughts. But that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video, and if you really like it, remember to subscribe down below. I also do a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that, so definitely check that out. Leave a link to in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.